Good morning and welcome to the Center for New American Security's annual conference, once again this year held virtually. I'm Richard Fontaine, the CEO of CNAS, and we're very pleased that you could all join us today and throughout the conference, which will take place over 6 days across this week and next. The theme of this year's gathering is a new American security. And that may not seem all that novel coming from a place called the Center for a New American Security. But think about it for just a minute. Think about how much has changed just in the last 18 months. December 7th, 2019 was 18 months ago. On that day, if you look at the headlines, the Labor Department reported job growth because, among other things, the General Motors strike was over. The unemployment rate was 3.5%. The White House was preparing for the impeachment trial of President Trump, the first impeachment trial. The extremism on military bases that made news was the shooting by a Saudi Air Force officer in Pensacola. You can see immediately what is not there. No global pandemic, no Great Depression scale rise in unemployment, no attack on the Capitol. The Black Lives Matter protests were yet to sweep the nation. Hong Kong still enjoyed its measure of autonomy. India and China had yet to clash on their border. American troops were fighting in Afghanistan, and Qasem Soleimani still commanded Iran's Quds Force. Solar winds and the pipeline hack and the Brexit withdrawal and the Biden presidency were all in the future. So as everyone knows, this past year and a half have been a period of very rapid change following longer term shifts. And so it feels like the right time to look indeed at a new American security. And so that's what we're going to do in the conference over these 6 days. Over the coming sessions, you'll hear a wide variety of views and ideas about the right approach to American security today. And to frame those discussions just a bit, I'd like this morning to pose 4 questions, the answers to which could lead us in very different directions. The first question is this: are we overemphasizing the China challenge? President Biden foresees what he calls extreme competition with China. Secretary of Defense lists China as America's sole, quote, pacing threat. And there's continuity here. President Trump's national security advisor described the Chinese Communist Party as, quote, the threat of the century, with Beijing seeking dominance in all domains and sectors. And these days, the China challenge is one of the few, maybe the only issue that brings together Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill with a raft of legislation aimed at dealing with it. But of course, American policymakers have a long tradition of deciding all of a sudden that everything Washington was doing was wrong, that it's behind the curve in responding to a new threat, that a titanic effort is required to avoid the worst outcomes. During the Cold War, communism was seen as such a threat that influencing the domestic governance of Laos merited a massive military intervention. George W. Bush entered office hoping to focus on things like, well, China and Russia. But suddenly we had a war against terrorists across the entire world. And now top officials suggest that not only a whole of government, but a, quote, whole of society effort is necessary to safeguard our freedom, our prosperity, our values in the face of China's rise. So maybe this time is different. Maybe this time this emphasis is merited. If it is, if we are meriting this emphasis, then the China challenge is so threatening and so formidable that it requires a whole of society response. Well, it seems America is in fact behind the curve. But on the other hand, if we are overemphasizing it, then we risk at a minimum pulling attention and resources away from other issues: terrorism, climate change, pandemics, domestic renewal, and regions like Europe and the Middle East that merit our foreign policy energy on their own terms. So the answer to this fundamental question about just how squarely to focus on China and our national security policy is going to matter quite a lot to everything else. The second question is related to the first, and that is, can the United States safely leave Afghanistan? Americans are tired of the war, for sure. The decision to withdraw U.S. forces has the air of finality, and many observers note the extraordinary levels of blood and treasure invested in Afghanistan and the poor results of them. The U.S. went to Afghanistan to rid it of al-Qaeda, as people say, not to impose Jeffersonian democracy. And if you're worried about terrorism, well, there are plenty of other places around the world that terrorists might find safe haven and we could worry about instead. But last week, the United Nations issued a new report. And in that report, it says the Taliban remains, quote, closely aligned with al-Qaeda, which has threatened war on all fronts against the United States after the withdrawal. Taliban look better poised to take power than at any time since 9/11. And the UN report says that, quote, a significant part of al-Qaeda's leadership remains in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. So the question, can the US safely leave Afghanistan? The answer might be yes, because peace will prevail there and there won't be much of a safe haven, or peace won't prevail there, but the terrorist threat won't really materialize, or because the terrorist threat does materialize, but the US can conduct effective counterterrorism operations from bases outside the country. One of those scenarios would set the stage, at least potentially, for a renewed focus on the Indo-Pacific, with all the dollars and the troops and the efforts now reorienting to deal with the China challenge. But of course, the answer could well be no. Terrorist threats could reemerge, with the US having rendered itself less able to deal with them. If they pose a threat to the United States, it's easy to imagine a refocus on Afghanistan. Following the American withdrawal from Iraq, after all, it took 5 years and a huge military effort to destroy the ISIS caliphate. And anything like a renewed effort that looked like that could quite easily pull attention and resources away from China, our stated #1 priority. So again, how we assess the future of Afghanistan has ripple effects on all the other things that we may care about in our national security policy. Third question I'd pose is whether America needs a more affirmative international economic agenda. A lot of observers have argued that there's a significant portion of the American population that's been on the losing side of globalization. They've seen their manufacturing jobs, their wages, their status decline in the face of international competition. And this, in turn, is said to have generated, among other things, outrage at politicians, a turn toward populism, general middle-class dissatisfaction. And one prescription that's now popular on both sides of the aisle is to defend Americans against this competition with tariffs, Buy America provisions, and other protective measures. But if you look at it, the United States has actually not pursued greater global economic integration over the past decade or more. Trade as a percentage of GDP has fallen. New FTAs have gone almost extinct. There are two major multilateral trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, the region of our top priority. The United States is party in neither of those. And throughout it all, these economic issues that I just mentioned, the populism, the dissatisfaction, rose rather than declined. So if it's best to have mostly a defensive economic agenda, then we should look for more protections, more tariffs and other barriers, coupled with new export controls, more investment screening, and an industrial policy in which the United States government allocates capital to the private sector in areas of strategic importance as defined by the government. If the United States needs a more affirmative agenda, however, either in lieu of or in addition to those things, maybe because protectionism and industrial policy produce net inefficiencies, or because domestic economic policy is better suited to heal America's economic divide, or because economic leadership confers geopolitical influence in the regions we care most about. If those things obtain, then we would see a very different international economic agenda than that which is shaping up in the executive branch and in Congress today. And the fourth and final question is this, and it's one that animates lots of discussion going back many decades. Is the United States rising or declining as a global power? This sort of pops up from time to time when there are periods of insecurity or doubt among Americans, and it's more popular among Americans probably than anyone else in the world. It's easy to look over the past year, the pandemic, the recession, the deficits, the political divisions, and point to American decline. Or you could look over a longer period of time. China's GDP growth rates have been higher than America's for some 30 years. U.S. share of global GDP has come down. China's increased its military budget and capabilities significantly. There are worries about American decline in technology and innovation, economic dynamism, relative military strength, and ultimately geopolitical weight. But of course, worrying about American decline is a pretty time-honored tradition among foreign policy types. You can just think of Sputnik, the Vietnam War, the Japan competition in the 1980s, the rise of the Rest in 1990s and early 2000s. The United States still has the world's biggest economy, at least for now, by far the world's biggest defense budget, the most bases abroad, the most allies, and could go on. But if the United States is declining, then reducing America's foreign policy ambitions would seem imperative, along with toning down the risk in our great power relationships. But if this time is like the others and America's capacity for renewal kicks in, or if our competitors face problems of their own that are at least as difficult as ours, then perhaps global ambition is not such a bad thing. Perhaps a little risk in our relationships with countries like China and Russia is tolerable. Formulating good answers to tough national security questions, even these kind of binary ones, the way I've framed them here is, it's tough, and yet it's why we're here today. It's why CNAS exists, and I'm very much looking forward to all of you diving into the discussion, hopefully coming out of it better informed, more thoughtful, and more motivated than all of us were at the outset. I'll close with a principle that I think America might do well to embrace a bit more in its approach to the world, and that's balance. China's, in my view, the chief long-run challenge, but America is not, has not, will not be a regional power. More matters than just the Indo-Pacific. Counterterrorism efforts are important not only to protecting the homeland, but to avoid the distortion of our global priorities. Exposure to international economic competition can be coupled with domestic measures to improve the lives of those disadvantaged by economic change. It's hard to say right now, I think, whether we're seeing an overall American rise or an overall American decline, but a balanced approach to foreign policy might help serve us best in either scenario. And so we wouldn't ignore some risks in favor of the others, or values in favor of interests, or disengagement in favor of global activism. We'd prioritize, but we'd balance. Our portfolio of national security policy and our approach to the world. Before we get into the discussion that is about to follow in just a moment, let me take a moment to recognize our conference sponsors that help make this possible. And they include American Rheinmetall Defense, Exeter, Google, Huntington Ingalls Industries, Leidos, Microsoft Corporation, Palace Advisors, Qualcomm, and the Boeing Company. Thanks to you and to our other institutional donors for helping us to bring together this great group of experts as part of our 2021 conference. And I'd also like to thank Axios, which is our media partner in this enterprise. And of course, thanks to all of you tuning in and joining us today. And I hope you will be as active as you possibly can in the discussion, in the chat, and in every other way of sort of getting involved. If you'd like to engage in the session that's about to follow, or any of the others, you can follow us on Twitter at CNASDC. You can tweet using the hashtag CNAS2021, and you can actually join the conversation and submit questions by using the chat on the official conference website, conference.cnas.org, or cnas.org/live. So lots of ways to participate in this over the coming days. Hope you will do so, and thanks to everyone for joining us. And with that, let's move right into our first panel discussion. And this one will focus on America's changing foreign policy landscape. It'll be moderated by Dave Lawler, who is World News Editor at Axios, and it'll include Ilan Goldenberg, who is Senior Fellow and Director of CNAS's Middle East Security Program, Stacie Pettyjohn, Senior Fellow and Director of our Defense Program, Vance Serchuk, who is an Adjunct Senior Fellow at CNAS, and he's Executive Director of the KKR Global Institute, and Amy Studdart, who is a Senior Advisor at the International Republican Institute and founder and CEO of Villager. So with that, let me turn it over to Dave Lawler, who will moderate our opening panel. And thanks, and over to you, Dave.
Thanks so much, Richard, both for inviting me and for posing some great questions in the introduction, which I will be sure to steal from throughout this panel. I'm thrilled to be joined by these distinguished panelists and by all of you who are tuning in. As Richard mentioned, please do ask your questions at any time in this panel. I don't want to just make it 15 minutes at the end. If you have a question, submit it, and I'll try to integrate as many as I can throughout the conversation. So since we're talking about the foreign policy landscape, as Richard just said, I thought we might start with Biden's first foreign trip, which starts tomorrow, and pull out some of the foreign policy challenges that we'll see along the way over the next week or so. So Amy, let's start with the G7. They're gathering in Cornwall on Thursday, lucky them. But these are the world's big, rich democracies. This is Biden's, America is back, multilateralism is back, democracy is back tour, basically. I wonder what you think what you're looking for, and maybe what countries around the world are looking for to see whether, this sort of thing, this multilateralism is back concept works for the world on things like whether it's, sharing vaccines, fighting climate change, whatever the issues might be. Curious what you make of that.
Thanks so much, Dave. What a wonderful question. And huge thanks as well to CNAS for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure and a joy. So my work, I work with civil society organizations and grassroots organizations all around the world. And so I've had this really interesting view on what the competition looks like, right? Going back to Richard's sort of opening question, are we overestimating the China challenge? Are we putting that too much front and center? And the way that I see it, looking at the technology question and then how it's playing out at the super local grassroots level, we're sort of going through this tectonic shift. The reason that the competition matters is because the world is completely changing. And so we have this moment, we're in a system competition. And the system competition is a question of which system is better for a universe in which nation states don't matter as much. Almost all threats are in some sense or another transnational. We've seen this with COVID, but all of the other issues you mentioned as well, climate change, everything to do with technology, cyber attacks, all of the ransomware attacks that we're seeing. So many of the threats that impact our daily lives are transnational, and so many of the opportunities for increases in agency, increases in transparency, improvements to human life are also transnational. And so the way that we see this playing out at the hyperlocal level is, China is presenting an option that is really about control, that says, the way that you can get a handle on all of this, government X or civil society organization Y, is by clamping down on free speech, by putting in place surveillance architecture, by really controlling the space. And we've seen that in the response to COVID and the way that China has approached that as well. The question for me and what I'm really looking for here is whether or not the US can take a leadership role in this space, and whether Biden can sort of walk this line of saying, yes, the US has so much to offer. We're still the world's most advanced democracy. We're still the richest democracy. We've still played a really big role in this space. Many of the major actors are here in the US and we have influence over them, but we're going to do this collaboratively with the rest of the world's democracies, because the system competition is about whether or not democracy, not democracies, survive over the next decade or two. And so what I'm really looking for is, does the Biden administration use the G7 and this framework of the advanced democracies as a way of galvanizing a global democratic movement, recognizing the import of the G7 democracies within that, and sort of steering it forward in that sense?
Great, thanks. And there's a lot of threads to pull on there, but let's keep the tour moving. Stacie, Biden will head to Brussels after the G7 for a NATO summit. NATO obviously went through something of an identity crisis over the last 4 years. We had Trump saying it was becoming irrelevant, Macron saying it was brain dead. Is that identity crisis over now that Biden's in? What do you see as the big questions the NATO alliance has to answer?
Thanks, Dave. I don't think the identity crisis is over, though from the Biden administration's perspective, this summit is an opportunity to move forward and to rally democracies to face the shared threats that are out there, as Amy had mentioned. So President Biden is really focused on renewing and repairing the US's relationship with NATO, and by affirming the fact that the United States has an unwavering commitment to Article 5, which is the self-defense clause within the NATO treaty. But I don't think it's clear that NATO member states and other partners in the region feel that they can depend on the United States after the last 4 years. There's a fear that President Trump, who called NATO obsolete and chastised many of the members for, quote, not paying their bills or investing enough in defense, could return, or that another nationalist president could be elected in the next election. So these concerns were exacerbated by Trump's unilateral and abrupt announcements that he was pulling 12,000 troops out of Germany and he was withdrawing from Afghanistan without consulting with allies beforehand. So President Biden's trying to walk a fine line at this summit where he wants to encourage member states to continue to invest in defense to not only counter Russia, but also China. And the summit needs to address important issues that are on the table right now, such as withdrawing forces from Afghanistan and determining how NATO is going to continue to support the Afghan military after its forces leave the country. It's not clear to me that many of our European allies view China as a threat, or that it actually makes sense for European states to try to focus their attention on the Indo-Pacific versus shoring up the military conventional balance in their own neighborhood, encountering Russian subconventional aggression, such as the cyber attacks we've seen recently and the rampant disinformation that's out there.
And I think that's a theme that will come up a lot, the extent to which allies can depend on the United States going forward. That will probably be a theme of this conversation and of the next 4 years and beyond. But Ilan, Biden's heading to Europe, but some news from the Middle East will follow him there. Obviously, Iran talks are still in a pretty critical phase, and the U.S. and European allies had quite different perspectives on how to handle the recent Gaza crisis at the UN, at least. Do you expect those issues to be, on the agenda at the G7? Do you expect leaders to be putting their heads together on that, G7 or NATO, basically? Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Dave, and thanks everyone for joining us for the session. And great to be with these great other panelists. Look, I think the challenge for the Biden administration, and you're going to see it starting now in the Middle East, is precisely what Richard talked about: balance, right? We have this history in the last 20 years of we've had it with the Middle East. We're leaving. We're going to Asia. Like Barack Obama pivoted to Asia. Donald Trump, had a national defense strategy involving basically moving away from the Middle East into the Indo-Pacific. Even George Bush, Condi Rice wrote her foreign affairs article in 2000, which kind of outlined the George W. Bush sort of foreign policy doctrine coming in was enough of these small distracting wars. We need to worry about, competition with Russia and China. And yet somehow we always end up back in the Middle East. And I think the challenge is people say, well, it's because, you might leave the Middle East, but the Middle East never leaves you. I would argue it's because of bad American policy and bad decisions by the United States, where we're incapable of just kind of managing the problems and engaging with them in a way that we need to, and then being able to focus on other things. We're either like, we're done with this and we leave, and then everything explodes in our face and we're back in. And when we go back in, we go all in again. And even I'd say something like the counter ISIS campaign, just a few thousand troops, but it was the number one sort of issue taking up senior leaders' time over the last 2 years of the Obama administration. So it's not just about troops and money. It's also just about senior leader time. And so this is going to be the challenge for a Biden administration coming in. How do we manage these challenges in a way that makes sense? And this recent conflict between Israel and Hamas and the blow up in Gaza and in Jerusalem is a good example of that, where the administration came in and they were not interested in dealing with this problem. Their view was, we're not going to have the Secretary of State be the action officer for the Middle East peace process. And that's absolutely 100% the right instinct. Like, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should not be at the top of the American agenda, the other issues we've been talking about. But if you walk away from it altogether, it has a way of blowing up, and then domestic politics, international pressure, and Joe Biden spends a week making 8 or 9 phone calls, and Blinken and Jake Sullivan and all these people are just fully engaged for a week. The president goes to Michigan to talk about electric cars, and it becomes all about, protests from the Arab American community about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think the challenge for them is going to be, it has to be on the agenda. It just can't dominate the agenda. It has to be properly on the agenda. And that's going to matter in terms of the Iran nuclear talks. It's going to matter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It should matter. It's sort of how we should be viewing Afghanistan as well, in my view, which is where, maybe a small force is better than no force at all, as long as you're not completely absorbed in trying to sort of rebuild the state and rebuild the military from scratch. So this, I think, is going to be their challenge as they go into this, not just at this conference, but really dealing with this region over the next 4 years.
We actually just got an audience question in from Sam, just on the exact point you were just making, Ilan, about the unexpected crises that could push the Biden administration off of their stated priorities. And I want to return to that idea after we finish our tour of this trip. But actually, just quickly, there's another bilateral meeting that's been kind of overlooked here on this agenda. And Biden's going to meet with President Erdogan of Turkey while he's in Brussels for NATO. I wonder what your take is on that meeting. Obviously, there's some history between those two leaders. The relationship is in kind of an uncomfortable point. I'm just would love your thoughts quickly on that meeting as well.
Sure. I mean, well, the bottom line with Turkey is, they are a NATO ally, but, for the most part, if you look at their interests and our interests, I wouldn't necessarily call them an ally anymore. I'd call them a country who we can work together with on some things, but we have some real differences with too. And that's kind of how you have to manage a relationship. I mean, we have divergences on issues as, Erdogan becomes increasingly authoritarian, repression of the press. Inside Turkey, I think their concerns over our support for the Kurds in Syria, especially during the counter-ISIS campaign, as well as our approach to the attempted coup that they dealt with, also put some real challenges in the relationship. And the fact that the Turks, are now buying S-400s from the Russians, which I would say is more of a function of all these other disagreements to some extent. Is increasingly they're hedging, they're looking at Russia, they're looking at the Middle East, they're looking less at Europe. And so these are all challenges in the relationship, but at the same time, Turkey remains, the second largest military in NATO. I think there are ways we can work together, for example, on humanitarian assistance into Syria and stabilizing the situation there. I think there's been some noise lately about Turkey increasingly engaging with Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others to kind of de-escalate tensions in the region. And Turkey is one of the players in the Middle East where all these countries are intervening in everybody else's affairs, especially in conflict zones like Syria and Libya. And so I don't think it'll be a comfortable meeting, and I think a successful meeting I would define as, like President Biden laying out our disagreements, but also finding areas where we can work together and agree on some things with the Turks. And that's kind of where I expect it will go. If that's how we set up our expectations. If we set up our expectations that somehow we're going to be able to put this relationship back to where it was, it's going to be a disappointment.
Got it. And that all leads us to what I think will be the most closely watched stop potentially on Biden's trip to Europe, the meeting with Vladimir Putin in Geneva. Vance, the White House says this meeting is part of its efforts to seek a, quote, stable and predictable relationship with Putin's Russia. I wonder what you make of that objective and what you're looking for or expecting from this meeting.
Well, thanks, Dave. And let me also just say it's a privilege to be part of the conference and the digital stage, which such a distinguished group of co-panelists. So look, let's start with the good news. Every president since the collapse of the Soviet Union that we have elected has come to office with the conviction that he can unlock some sort of personal strategic partnership with his Kremlin counterpart. Donald Trump, in at least this respect, was not an outlier. We had President Obama trying to bond with Dmitry Medvedev over burgers in Arlington. We had President George W. Bush looking into Vladimir Putin's eyes and seeing his soul in Slovenia. And we had the Bill and Boris show in the 1990s. So, the Churchill quote about you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after trying all of the alternatives. We now have a president who has come to office for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union with the tenet that Russia, as it is now, is not a potential strategic partner for building or upholding world order, but is an adversary which is working towards destabilizing and revising key parts of that global order. So I think that's the good news. We are grounded in greater realism from day one. As you said, Dave, the Biden administration's stated objective is to try to achieve a relationship with Russia that is more stable and more predictable. And that is, I think, a noble objective. It's also a very reasonable one insofar as both stability and predictability would be good things for the United States. I think, though, the question is, what does Russia want and what does Putin want? And historically, as the weaker party, Putin has relied heavily on subterfuge, on misdirection, on surprise, trying to keep us off balance and guessing what his next move will be. So I do think that there's a fundamental question about whether or not you can ultimately achieve a relationship characterized by stability and predictability when your counterparty is committed to being unpredictable and their strategic goal is to achieve instability. So I think that that's sort of challenge number one. The second point, and I think it's a sort of a deeper one that we're all going to sort of be wrestling with here, is, we have broadly embraced the concept of great power competition. That is a point of continuity from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. But in practice, what does that really mean, and what does that really look like? And in the case of Russia in particular, but I think to some extent this also applies as a question for China, I think that the instinct of the Biden administration is to start strong, to try to rebuild a situation of American strength, demonstrate that we are going to be prepared to stand up for our interests, but then really hope at some point down the line that we can get down to business and that we can do some sort of deals, that we can try to find some sort of more relatable, more reliable modus vivendi. I think that the fundamental question, though, that still is yet to be resolved in both cases is that going to work? Lastly, we got a great question from the audience about what the unexpected things could happen that could blow us off course. Looking at that question, I'm reminded of the great Bob Gates line that America has the perfect track record in predicting the next crisis. We always get it wrong. Russia is unique in that we are simultaneously threatened by Russian strength, but also by Russian weakness. And historically, Russia has really had two settings, right? Expansion and collapse. The only thing to me that is more frightening than a strong, assertive Russia, which is flexing its muscles on the world stage and trying to reestablish, as it understands it, its traditional interests over its near abroad and even globally with some of the capabilities that they've developed, is the prospect that in the next decade, we could have another Russian collapse. Now, the last time we had a Russian collapse, we got off very, very easy. But the time before that, after 1917, we had basically civil war across all of Eurasia for several years. If you imagine today what would happen if you had Syria over 12 time zones with cyber, nukes, chemical weapons, all of these things thrown in, that is a very, very scary prospect. And I think it goes to Richard's point about the potential range of crises that we're going to confront in the 2020s being probably much broader and requiring much more imagination than our current focus, while appropriate, on rising China.
Well, before we move on from that, does anybody else on the panel want to take a stab at Sam's question? I know that Vance just told us that America has a 0% track record of getting the next crisis right. But if anybody on the panel wants to try to improve that percentage a little bit, and what is our eyes not on that could become a crisis for the Biden administration, that I welcome any of you to jump in. Ilan?
I'll jump in unless somebody else wants to, Stacie or Amy. No. All right. Well, here I'll start, and this is fine. I'm going to fall into the totally predictable category of unexpected crises. So this is not as creative as Vance's collapse of Russia and civil war across Eurasia, which kind of terrifies me, Vance. I hope we're not going there. But look, when I look at the Middle East, at least, what's the issue that's most likely to sort of blow the Biden administration off course? It's Iran. And it's specifically if we don't get back into the JCPOA. The administration came in with the view of first we get back into the JCPOA, then we sort of build on that and deal with other issues, through a combination of, de-escalatory diplomacy in the region and ultimately also a follow-on the nuclear accord. And I very much supported that approach and have written as much, a year ago. And I should say it doesn't have to be the JCPOA. It could be some other de-escalatory nuclear deal, or it can be something better or worse. I think that the JCPOA return is by far the most realistic. And I kind of expected that this would work. And I think the jury is still out. We don't know if the Iranians are ultimately interested. The conversations in Vienna have moved positively to some extent. I don't think we're going to have a return to the JCPOA or even an agreement before the Iranian elections in mid-June. Afterwards, you might have a much more hardline government inside of Iran coming in August. And so you might not get back to a deal, or you might get to a deal between this June and August interregnum, which might make actually a lot of sense for the supreme leader to sort of let the current more moderate government cut the deal and do the negative part of all the nuclear concessions, while the incoming harder line government takes all the credit for the economic benefit. But the key is, I will tell you, if you told me that we'd be in the early June and you would have no direct dialogue yet between the U.S. and Iran, I'd be both surprised and disappointed. And I'm sure folks in the Biden administration, I should say, would be too, as would folks in the Obama administration. But the key to this, though, is if you get back and if you put the nuclear issue back in a box, you have a lot more space to operate in the region over time. You have time to manage these challenges. If you don't, and Iran's nuclear program continues as is, you have crises coming pretty quickly, potentially down the road, just a few months from now, that make it a lot more challenging to do everything else, especially as Iran starts to get closer and closer to nuclear threshold. I think Tony Blinken spoke earlier this week, I think yesterday, at a congressional hearing about potentially a dash time of only weeks away. So this is what I'm watching most closely, and could be a key pivot in terms of whether we're able to just kind of properly put the Middle East in a box and focus more on other issues while balancing that, or whether this issue starts to absorb more and more of our U.S. bandwidth. Great.
Amy or Stacie, if you have a crisis, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just shift on here. But so Amy, on this theme of great power competition, I wonder how that interacts with Biden's democracy agenda. Obviously, that's one of the big things he's come into office saying. He wants to strengthen the world's democracies, and part of that is that you strengthen the world's democracies, in contrast to China, which has a different model. But I do think, the administration early on has engaged places like Cambodia that aren't exactly on the democracy agenda because of the China challenge, right? It's a China influence thing. We just did an interview at Axios with the president of Ukraine. I can tell you he's not happy that Putin got a meeting with Biden before he did. And so, I wonder, do you see the sort of competition with China more so than Russia, but do you see that as a galvanizing effect for this democracy movement, or maybe something that's a competing priority potentially?
That's such a good question. I think the way that I see it is that it really depends on how we view the competition with China. If we think that the competition with China is about taking China down, right, that we're actually in a sort of fist fight with China, and we need to make sure that the regulatory framework, international regulatory and taxation frameworks, are ones that mean that American companies or companies in democracies win as opposed to Chinese companies, or if we think that it's about military buildup and the idea is that we just need to be bigger, and beat them, then I think they stand in conflict, right? And that will fundamentally, over time, undermine the democracy agenda. And we see this in particular on tech and tech companies, where you have this argument that keeps coming out of Silicon Valley that says, oh, no, you can't have antitrust. Oh, no, you can't really, regulate us, because then we won't be able to compete with the Chinese giants. But that fundamentally is then can be seen as anti-democratic, because it's not allowing for a democratic framework of regulation around what technology looks like and how it's developed. And so if the goal is to beat China on China's terms, essentially, which is what that boils down to, then democracy doesn't win. If the goal is to say what we're doing is the competition with China is about what system reigns, what rules there are, who works together and who doesn't, who is empowered and who isn't, then absolutely it can work out. And the way that we see this at IRI is that, yes, there are democratic governments, and there are anti-democratic governments, and there are authoritarian governments, but there's democratic actors everywhere, right? There are democratic actors in China. There are civil society organizations. There are people who are fighting to open up space to have agency within their own lives everywhere. And that's certainly true in Cambodia. And so I think it's not necessarily, is the Biden administration working with Cambodia? Is the Biden administration strengthening those aspects of authoritarian leaning or authoritarian countries that are authoritarian, or is it pushing them in the direction of opening and, saying, this democracy thing can work for you too?
Got it. And at the risk of, as Richard put it, overemphasizing the China challenge, Stacie, one for you on China as well. The Pentagon obviously is conducting a review of, how they can move resources around to prepare for the China challenge. What do you view as sort of the key questions that they need to address? What are the big decisions that need to be made as the U.S. military prepares for what Biden has positioned as kind of a century of competition with China?
The U.S. military is obviously focused on the military competition with China, but there are a lot of unresolved debates within the Pentagon right now that are related to that. And as Vance suggested, what great power competition, even with China, really means. We've seen some of these surface recently in the press in terms of whether the Joint Force is going to be prioritizing the near-term competition and trying to shore up the balance in the Indo-Pacific region in the near term, in the next 5 or so years, because there are fears that there's a window of vulnerability that are opening up that China might try to take advantage of, or whether the Pentagon should be focused on the longer-term military technical competition and really making investments in emerging and potentially game-changing technologies where it will secure an advantage in the long run. So we've seen with IndoPACOM, and they had their Pacific Deterrence Initiative request to Congress, which asked for $4.6 billion in the FY22 budget and $27 billion over the next 5 years to fund a lot of near-term investments, improvements in posture to make the U.S. forces in the region more resilient and able to absorb an attack, to enhance their firepower, and to improve the air and missile defenses. On the other side of the fence, you see those who feel like the Pentagon needs to conserve funds and to put them into RDT&E, which also got plussed up in the FY22 budget, so that they can invest in artificial intelligence, cyber technologies, autonomous systems, hypersonics, those type of potentially game-changing new systems that could come online in the next 5 to 10 years, probably. Related, but somewhat separate to this, there are questions about whether the U.S. military should remain postured close to China inside the first and second island chains in Japan and Guam, or whether it should pull farther back to U.S. territories, Hawaii states, Hawaii, Alaska, or the continental United States, where it is safer and more survivable. There are questions about which sort of posture is necessary and whether the United States could win and deter from standoff ranges in the U.S. And finally, this is related to the last discussion, which is about whether the Pentagon is really prioritizing day-to-day competition with China. That's countering a lot of Chinese gray zone tactics in the East and South China Sea, their use of the maritime militia, fishing vessels, harassing other countries' boats and aircraft, and contesting different disputed islands in the region, and whether the U.S. military needs to be there to push back against them every time that they do so with presence, or whether the U.S. military really needs to focus on preparing for a high-end conflict so that it can strengthen deterrence, and that it needs to conserve its readiness. It needs to keep its forces at home to train with an eye towards this really high-intensity conflict that it hasn't seen or experienced, thankfully, in a long time. So hopefully we'll find a resolution to some of these issues in the National Defense Strategy and the FY23 budget. But right now, they're all open questions.
Got it. And Stacie, I actually want to stick with you for a second because we just got a question from Frank who asks, are we capable of and willing to set red lines in space, for example, and then back up the talk with what will certainly require physical military response? It's an interesting idea. Obviously, when people hear red lines now, they think of Obama, Syria. But more broadly, are we able to set points at which our adversaries cannot cross or else risk a military response?
We certainly can set red lines, but we do want to be willing to back them up, and that ultimately will be a political decision. I think in space, the more pressing question that is related to red lines is establishing norms. And this is norms of behavior for both military satellites and spacecraft and civilian ones. Since space is becoming more crowded, you have a lot of commercial companies sending up satellites and also people. We need to sort of establish a regime for how to deal with this. There have been some issues in the past year where I believe it was Russian satellites were becoming operating very close to some US ones. And there are norms that need to be established about what is acceptable and expected behavior and safe behavior for the operation of these different satellites as space becomes more proliferated.
Got it. And Vance, I welcome any thoughts you have on all of that great power competition stuff. I know you were the one who started us on that train, but also I want to bring in a question from Mark in the audience who asks, what message does a hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan send our current and prospective allies and partners? I know you were concerned about the idea of a hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, so would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I mean, I think that there are a lot of really compelling arguments against the approach that we're taking to Afghanistan right now. I confess that I don't think that the withdrawal, complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, as of yet, has really had a destabilizing effect on our allies and partners. I also think that the evidence is, at least not so far, there to suggest that any of our adversaries, either great power or otherwise, have drawn any kind of overarching strategic lesson from it. What I do think, however, the Afghanistan policy intersects with this wider question of China and great power competition in a couple different ways. First, one that Richard alluded to, which is that, look, by virtue of going to zero, if Afghanistan does blow up and a terrorism sanctuary reemerges there, we obviously had this experience with Iraq after 2011, where then subsequently you have to go back in, and it does become a much bigger, all-consuming enterprise than I think the alternative would have been, which was to keep a relatively small force there so that you can have it as a hedge. Second, one of the really interesting military questions, I'm curious what Stacie thinks about this in particular, is, we're essentially, not only is the war in Afghanistan not ending, U.S. involvement in that war also is not ending, according to the Biden administration. We are going to continue to have what they characterize as over-the-horizon counterterrorism approach to Afghanistan. What that means in practice is that we are pivoting away from the kinds of special operations forces on the ground, which are frankly not terribly needed in the Indo-Pacific, and instead we'll have to rely much more heavily on the kind of long-range fires, unmanned aircraft, long-range aircraft that are much more in demand in the Indo-Pacific. So from a pure military perspective, unless we're able to get bases that are immediately adjacent to Afghanistan, and even in that scenario, let's say it's Pakistan, let's say it is in Central Asia, well, then we are going to be more dependent on countries that have closer relations with the two countries that we've also identified as our great power rivals. Lastly, and I think the thing which at least unsettles me in a way the most, when we started this involvement in Afghanistan nearly 20 years ago, the US attitude towards the war on terror was eerily similar to the attitude that we have right now towards China. There was an overwhelming bipartisan consensus that this was the new defining challenge of the time, that we were going to throw everything at it. But as the costs began to accumulate, suddenly that bipartisan consensus about our commitment to this fight began to unravel, to the point that there is no longer even the political willingness to keep a few thousand troops in Afghanistan as we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11. What worries me the most is not necessarily what message we're sending to our allies and partners right now in 2021. What worries me really about Afghanistan is what it says about us, what it says about the United States, and our tendency on the one hand at the start of these things to really lean in heavy. But when the going gets tough, when the costs begin to accumulate, whether we really have the wherewithal to persist and to find the balance that Richard was referring to earlier, to be able to sustain commitments that we make. And I worry enormously in the case of China and Russia, particularly China, that we're leaning in really hard right now. Where will we be in 15 years, in 20 years? Particularly as we discover that competition with China is going to be really, really hard, really dangerous, much more so, frankly, than the last 20 years have been with the war on terror.
It does feel like the question that Richard started us on with, are we overemphasizing the China challenge at the expense of other priorities, is really core here. So maybe I'll try to save a couple minutes at the end and go down the line and everybody can give their views on that question. I want to keep, since we're on the clock, I want to keep cycling through these great audience questions. I swear I had questions of my own, but I'm going to keep going with the audience here. Ilan, I want to throw this one to you from Katie. The Biden administration has been trying to show that America is back. How is the rest of the world receiving this shift? Are allies hesitant to welcome the US back, knowing that it might flip again with the next election? And I want to add a twist to that because you're a Middle East expert. What about countries like Egypt, for example, or Saudi Arabia that are getting the cold shoulder to a degree? Egypt less so after the Gaza crisis. But in general, these administrations who have more uncomfortable relations with Biden, do you think that they view the flip side, that they can wait out the Biden administration and they don't have to, they can be in the doghouse for a little while, but that things might flip again in 3-4 years when a new administration comes in?
Sure. Well, a couple of things. I want to engage first on Vance's last point there in terms of American staying power. I do think, and this goes back to, sometimes it's not about how much we invest, but whether we invest in a smart way or whether we invest in an incredibly costly way. And I think in the case of the war on terror, as it was framed in the early years, we made some big mistakes that have kind of hung with us for the last 20 years and framed that discussion and the costs associated with it. I'm not sure we would have ever had quite the negative reaction to what's happening in Afghanistan, or there would have been an insistence on zero troops if we hadn't done Iraq, for example, right? And so I think if we get this the China issue right, which in my mind has a lot more to do, frankly, with the things Amy focuses on and the things Stacie focuses on. They're both important, but the emphasis really is on an economic and technological competition with a military component supporting it, as opposed to military first, military only, which is kind of how we approach the Middle East and Afghanistan, like making that the centerpiece of our entire approach, which is part of the reason why it didn't work. Historically, what's worked for the United States is a strong military investment when necessary, but also combined with projecting our values, projecting our economic model. Like those are the things that also need to be a part of the equation. And we really lacked that in the Middle East, I would argue, and Afghanistan. It was all the military tools. Now, getting to your question, Dave, on sort of American reliability. It's a massive question mark. Our partners and allies are both incredibly relieved to have the Biden administration, but are pretty consistent in reminding us of what we've just been through and what they've been through in terms of managing the relationship, especially on the European side. And then in the Middle East, I think the Middle East has kind of been interesting on this front. On the one hand, yes, I'm sure the Saudis and the Egyptians miss having the sort of the green light for everything that they kind of got from the Trump administration, especially early on. But even there was kind of walked back over time, But it's actually been, I think what the Biden administration has done in both those cases has been kind of smart. It hasn't been the full cold shoulder. It's been kind of the pullback with a message of, look, if you're going to be, we have some issues, especially on issues like human rights, especially on issues like Jamal Khashoggi. And so you're not getting a green light from us on that. And we are going to raise those issues. But in the broader strategic sense, we need to see, are you a reliable partner or not? Are what you're doing in the Middle East constructive to our interests or not? And to the extent it is, we'll work with you. And if it isn't, you're going to get frozen out. And I think it's kind of working with the Saudis on some issues. We've seen sort of the walk away from the Qatar stalemate and the GCC break. I think that was, even I think the normalization agreement the UAE and Israel signed was partially like something that the Emiratis wanted to do, partially something for Trump. but also partially something for an incoming Democratic administration. And when you look at the Egyptians, I think they have played a constructive role in this latest Gaza conflict, which they would have played, I think, no matter what, because it's in their own interest to play that role. And they played it in 2014 and they played it in 2012 because they try to sort of manage that mess on their border. But maybe I would just say one other example has been increasing dialogue and engagement between Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, UAE, greater engagement with Iran. All these things are to some extent happening because there's a signaling from the Biden administration. It's not just us. They're doing it for their own interests too. We're not the sole driver of everything that happens in the Middle East. But at least part of it is an understanding that this will make the Biden administration happy and will put them on the right side of things in Washington. And that's core to their calculus. So I think that's been the approach. And I think thus far it seems to be yielding some early results. We have to see. But yeah, Donald Trump and the prospects of a total flip in American policy in 24 or 28 or 32, absolutely hangs in the background of every single engagement that we have.
Got it. And Amy, Ilan mentioned the work that you do in his answer, so I'll bring you in to talk about the work that you do. We actually have a question. How can the U.S. government partner with the private sector and specifically tech companies to counter the rise of digital authoritarianism globally, which sounds like something that's up your alley. So you could feel free to reflect on the other ideas that have come up, but also if you could touch on Katie's question as well, that would be great.
Absolutely. I'll just take the previous question if I can as well, given that I have the floor. It's interesting because so doing democracy assistance work around the world, over the last 4 years, we've seen more demand for it than ever before, right? For U.S. democracy assistance than ever before. Congress over the last 2 years oversaw the biggest increase in democracy assistance funding that has happened. And so the question of reliability and consistency is absolutely one, and messaging is a really big part of that, but policy is really core to it as well. And the United States isn't just who sits in the White House, it's all of these other organizations that exist as well. It's Congress, it's our government bureaucracies, it's CNAS, it's IRI, it's all of our different organizations. And I think that for all of the narrative that was playing out at the top, and certainly, high-level political relations, there was a lot of turmoil, but there was also consistency and reliability that was playing out underneath that as well. So on this question of partnering with the private sector, I think that that's going to be absolutely key. And I think that one of the major shifts that we've seen over the last little period here has been from U.S. technology companies and technology companies more broadly saying one of their major priorities is access to the Chinese market, right? How do we work with China to open up the Chinese market for U.S. tech or, tech companies in Europe as well? Obviously, that's no longer the case. The Chinese government is going after its own technology companies because it's weakening. There's a sense that it might be weakening CCP rule. There's, I think, a much bigger acceptance that a world ruled by China is not safe for Facebook or Google or even to some extent Apple, right? And so they don't want to see the boat rocked there too much. But certainly there's been a big shift there that these companies need a democratic world in which the US is at the forefront in order to maximize profits. So I think that that's been a positive shift. We're also starting, I think, to see experiments taking place that are going to help us create a democratic infrastructure that can survive the internet, and not just survive the internet, but thrive during the internet. So the Paris Call, which was really championed by Microsoft, the Paris Call for Peace and Security in Cyberspace, which was really championed by Microsoft, was driven by the fact that they kept getting put in the middle of nation states attacking other nation states and couldn't call it out because they're a private company, right? And so they have kind of been at the forefront of thinking through what is the model that means that we're creating a transparent, rule of law based global order that governs what happens in cyberspace and what is acceptable and what isn't. The oversight board, the Facebook oversight board, I think is going to be another really interesting experiment that we need to watch in this space, that is saying it shouldn't be a technology company. It shouldn't be Mark Zuckerberg deciding whether or not a democratically elected leader gets booted off the platform, but neither should it be a government deciding that. And so what is a third space that you can create that does allow for democratic discourse, that does facilitate all of that? So we're certainly starting to see the private sector not starting to see, but the private sector has quite thoroughly realized that it needs to be engaged in coming up with solutions that allow companies to be companies, governments to be governments, and then that there's some rule of law framework, some transparent framework that everyone can understand and take part in that exists outside of that. And so I would say, if I were in the Biden administration, I'd be really excited by those sorts of initiatives and encourage them a lot. And it's not to say that any one of them is the answer to the whole problem. It's not to say that the solution is going to come from the private sector, but certainly parts of the solution and the experiments that will lead to a solution are coming from the private sector right now.
It's interesting that you mentioned Microsoft in particular feeling stuck in between, because they just had this situation a few days ago where they, if you searched on Bing for Tank Man on the Tiananmen Square anniversary, you couldn't find a picture of the famous image of Tank Man. So that's obviously, they said it was human error. I'll leave it there. But I guess since we've been circling it over and over again, let's just take on the question that Richard set us at the beginning, which is this idea of, are we overemphasizing the China challenge relative to other priorities? And Vance, I guess I'll start with you. I'd like to hear from a couple of you. Stacie, maybe next. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, look, I think that we are reacting against what was long neglect of the reality of the strategic challenge posed by China. And there's a bit of an American tradition here, which is that we tend to be oblivious to a strategic challenger. Then we suddenly awaken to it. We thrash around wildly, and then if we're lucky, we begin to find our balance. So I don't have any disagreement with the characterization of China as the most significant, most capable strategic challenge that's out there. I think that the question is really, how do we deal with it first? And then two, how do we reconcile it with other priorities that we have? Now, the one thing I guess I would also say, to just be a little bit contrarian, is that in one respect, I actually think that we're probably still underreacting in the following sense. At the beginning of the Cold War, the threat of the Soviet Union galvanized us to do truly difficult, painful things that we had never done before. It changed the political laws of gravity in Washington, D.C., right? We would not have previously been able to have NATO. We would not previously have been able to have the Marshall Plan. Even inside the United States, sweeping changes, Brown versus Board of Education, there was a Cold War overhang that helped compel us to confront what was the ultimate abomination, right? State-sanctioned discrimination, segregation. I'm struck and frankly a little bit troubled that when it comes to China, I think that thus far it is still predominantly an alibi for different parts of the government to do the things that they otherwise wanted to do, right? So if it comes to industrial policy, yes, we can throw more money. When it comes to the Pentagon, oh man, we get to stop doing this counterinsurgency thing and we can start investing in really cool weapon systems. Count me in. When the conversation turns to tougher stuff, like, hey, how about a strategic immigration policy? Because at the end of the day, anyone can move to the United States and become American, and no one can move to China and become Chinese. So maybe that's a big strategic advantage. Ooh, that's a little bit tougher. Okay, how about trade policy, as Richard referenced? If you spend time in the Indo-Pacific and you say, well, what do we really need to do to compete? Well, that thing called Trans-Pacific Partnership, that tends to end up pretty high on the list. Ooh, that's a tough one to have a conversation with Republicans or Democrats alike. How about military spending? Well, that's a tough conversation also to have on Capitol Hill. So, I look at this, and on the one hand, there's absolutely a rhetorical emphasis. There's a willingness to dial up the language about China to about 11 out of 10. But when it really gets tough, when you really say, okay, are you now prepared to do things that are hard, politically painful? I find that across the board, the answer is, no, we're actually not that interested in that.
That's a really interesting point. It's actually something that I think Jake Sullivan wrote about before he got into the administration, about will China be the galvanizing thing to get us to do the things we should have been doing anyways in terms of education and research and development and things like that. And so it's an interesting point there. So it's basically from Vance a qualified no in terms of the idea of are we overemphasizing the China challenge at the expense of other priorities. Stacie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that now.
I think I largely agree with Vance here in terms of focusing on China is really needed to overcome some of the obstacles and resistance that exist within the bureaucracy, within Congress to making changes. Historically, the United States has only really mobilized in different ways when there has been a clear and unambiguous threat. And so focusing on China provides that and helps to align resources to a strategy. That being said, I think the United States needs to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have a lot of obligations and interest worldwide and need to be able to fulfill them. But in the last period of time since the end of the Cold War, you've seen that the US hasn't actually been focused, and that has meant that we have made a number of bad decisions in terms of investments for the Pentagon. And right now, moving the Pentagon is like shifting the Titanic. And I think a laser focus on China is really needed to make the changes that are necessary and are likely to be painful. They're not always things that the services really want. They're not things that are particularly palatable to those on the Hill, because they're going to be making investments in new technologies and capabilities that don't exist, divesting of things that are made in congressional districts. But this has to happen if we're going to manage to meet the military component of the China challenge. I do think that the broader piece of great power competition is a whole of government one, and the military is just one small piece of it, and that the military should remain focused on the challenge of deterring aggression, and that the other parts of government should be funded to compete in their areas.
Got it. So similar there. Ilan, go ahead. Your take on this question.
Sure. Well, look, so I'd say two things. I'd probably say probably we are maybe emphasizing it to about the right extent, but it's going to matter. It's going to matter in terms of action. And also, I'd say that there's one other key issue that we need to put up there along with China. And the other one is sort of this nature of the sort of transnational challenges that we're facing globally, right? Whether that's, and some of them are very much related to China, but, global pandemics, the environment, I saw one of the questions in the chat we haven't gotten to is like, what's the one issue you'd love to see more bipartisan agreement on? I'd say the environment, and we have like what's basically a global, climate emergency in many ways, or at least it's coming. And so we can't be so fixated on China so as to forget about these other things. Now, China obviously is a huge player in those issues, but not necessarily only in the form of competition. In some ways, we need to figure out where we can cooperate with them on these issues, and that kind of goes in cross currents. So that's like one amendment that I would make. And then the second is just we have to see it actually in action. And as the Middle East guy who consistently is told, we're not going to spend as much time focusing on your issues than to have everybody totally absorbed. Like, there's three resources in government, I think, that are most important. One is money, one is people, and the third is senior leader time. And I would argue that on senior leader time, the Biden administration is doing better so far. And they've also done a better job, I think, of staffing the administration by creating more jobs on the Indo-Pacific and on these transnational issues than sort of overemphasizing the Middle East. Like near the end of the Obama administration, you had so many people at the NSC focusing on the Middle East. I think somebody had told me at state policy planning at the end of the Obama administration, you had like 4 people focusing on Syria and 2 people focusing on the Indo-Pacific. So, I mean, that's a lot of it too. But like that's going to be discipline that's going to have to maintain itself when crises erupt in other parts of the world, which inevitably they will. And especially, I would argue, probably first and foremost in my region.
All right, Amy, I'll give you the last word since we're running out of time here. Either are we overestimating the China challenge, or as the other panelists have pointed out, is there an aspect of the China challenge that we're actually underestimating and should be paying more attention to?
So I'm 100% with Vance on this. We're paying about the amount of attention that we should be, but we're going about it all wrong. If we think that China is the competitor, then we need to think about what our competitive advantages are and what the landscape looks like and how we meet that landscape. And I think that immigration is absolutely the very best example of that, where one of our biggest assets is the United States of America is a place that people want to come and where they want to do good things and they want to help us win. So why aren't we figuring out how to make that happen?
Great. Well, thank you so much. And we actually finished right on time at 12:15. Thank you so much to our panelists for all of your insights. Also, thank you to the audience. I will say I've been in the moderator's chair for things like that, and you're waiting for audience questions to come in. And this time, all of you were flooding the chat with questions. So I appreciate that. It made my job much easier and the conversation much more stimulating, I think. So thank you so much to everyone. There's actually a break in the programming now until 12:30, when there will be a fireside chat with Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks. So thank you again to our panelists and to the audience, and I hope you'll all join for that at 12:30.